Okay, well, thanks for the organizers for organizing a great event, as ever. I'm looking forward to future events of this sort. And I don't know whether I should be thanking you for, once again, making me the last speaker. I don't know what you're trying to tell me. I think the expectation is everyone's gone home before I get a chance to come here, especially since, a lot of people are actually actively protesting to save the CU right now. So, solidarity with those who aren't here, because they're not here for a good reason. Shame on you for being here. Okay, cooperation. Okay, we've already heard some discussion about this question, about the cooperation problem. Humans are uniquely cooperative. Here's a very recent example from this week. On the top panel, you see the New Horizons probe reaching the furthest object ever seen in the solar system. That happened this week, and you can see mission control there, where everyone's very excited about this event being achieved without crashing it. And also this week, Chinese scientists landed a lunar probe onto the far side of the moon, the first time such an event has been achieved. Both of these remarkable achievements took place this week. Okay, so humans are uniquely cooperative in doing things that are inconceivable to other species. So the question is, what's the problem? And as we've heard already, there's problems of free riding, cheating, and defecting, which can cause cooperation to collapse. There's an additional problem that I'm interested in, which usually doesn't come up much, which is that humans are hyper-competitive. Okay, so we're the only species that really competes for the sake of competition. We have, for example, stone throwing in chimpanzees, and anyone who's ever been on the wrong end of a chimpanzee throwing something at you, they can be pretty effective. But they don't try to see who can throw a ball further than anyone. They don't try to win at cricket matches, and they certainly don't cheat at trying to win cricket matches. This was a famous case last year with Australian ball tampering, and here's the Australian captain cheating with his balls. I don't know enough about cricket, but it has something to do with scuffing the balls. Anyways, let's move on. Okay, so cooperation is a problem, and maybe the fact that we're so competitive can get in the way of it. And I think competition and cooperation borrow from the same substrates. And one of my favorite quotes about cooperation is, "It is not enough that I succeed, others may fail." And this has been attributed to Truman Capote, Oscar Wilde, who's the other guy, Gore Vidal, and Genghis Khan, among others. Okay, so we really, really care not just about our own wins and losses or gains, we also care about what happens to other people. Now, I regret that I don't have any videos to show you, but I will compensate with a family picture. So these are the kids of myself and Nausicaa. So this is Aaron and Liam. On Christmas Day, Aaron receives a chess set, and they both progress to sit down and play chess. So this is really cooperative, and chess is one of these great games because you actually have to cooperate to compete. Unfortunately, you never take photos of the interesting things like the aftermath of what happens. Liam doesn't really understand chess, and usually chess pieces are flying everywhere within a minute, but that's when we're busy trying to solve the problem, not taking pictures. And as an example, one of their favorite video games is called Rayman Legends, where you work together, you cooperate with your two characters, but they usually end up fighting each other in the middle of the game and getting upset, and then the blows usually result in actual physical violence between the two of them. So competition, or cooperation rather, is hard. Okay, so that's the main point I want to make at this moment. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some game theoretical approaches, not from a formal sense. I don't understand formal game theory. I just borrow some of their ideas. Game theory predicts, though, what rational agents should do when encountering other rational agents. And kindernomics is basically applying game theory to small-scale economists as opposed to small-scale economies. And we try to understand, using tools from economics, how children might behave rationally. The most famous game theoretical model, which all of you know very well and I won't belabor, is the prisoner's dilemma, where you've got different strategies. You've got an individual on the left, shown in red, who has a choice between cooperating and defecting, an individual at the top, shown in black, who can also cooperate or defect. And then you have the outcomes for their choices. And the outcome you get depends on the choices that another individual makes, hence the game theory. Now, the interesting thing about the prisoner's dilemma, which is the most widely used tool in evolutionary biology to understand cooperation, is that you don't get mutual cooperation. Now, cooperation would seem to be the best possible group outcome. If you both cooperate, you get the highest possible group payoff. However, the way the game is set up is that defecting is the best outcome for an individual, regardless of what the other individual does. As a result, both individuals knowing that other individuals are rational, the only equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium, is mutual defection. And so since mutual defection seems to be the optimal strategy, how can you get cooperation to evolve? The prisoner's dilemma has become something of a, well, it's a cottage industry. It's a big force in evolutionary biology. It influences a lot of thinking in psychology. It assumes that there's competition that needs to be overcome to achieve cooperative outcomes. But one assumption might be is that the game is too difficult. Maybe this isn't the best game to model cooperation. So another one that's been used more recently is the stag hunt, also called the assurance game. And the stag hunt, which is used to model Rousseau's world of peace and harmony and all of this, assumes that rational agents have in their best interest mutual cooperation. So you have a payoff of choosing stag, which is better than hare, and so you both work together to achieve this. And this is modeled more formally in a matrix like this, where you've got the payoff to choosing to cooperate together to hunt a stag, or to work independently to hunt a hare. Now, the problem that you face here is that if one of you decides to hunt stag and the other one chooses to hunt hare, the guy who hunts hare gets a hare, so he gets 1 point, but the guy who chooses to hunt stag gets nothing. So basically, you end up with two equilibria, so dominant strategies. There's a payoff dominant strategy where you maximize the group payoff as well as the individual payoff, and so that's where you both hunt stag. Or you can be risk dominant, when you choose the option that's safer, because you just don't know if you can trust the other guy to show up and do his bit, so you choose the stag option. Okay, so this is the risk-dominant strategy. There are two equilibria. Okay, this should result in mutualistic cooperation. Okay, the prisoner's dilemma is usually used to model altruism and tit for tat, reciprocity, generous tit for tat, and various other models. But here it is in the best interest of both individuals to cooperate or to coordinate their behavior. Now, the coordination of the stag hunt has been demonstrated in children before, as well as in chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys, so I've listed some of the studies here. I didn't list a study by Sarah Brosnan in 2011, not because it's not relevant, but because there are no pretty pictures associated with the paper. I Googled and Googled and Googled and couldn't find any pretty pictures. Sorry, Sarah. But I mentioned it. Okay, there, job's done. Okay, now the problem is the stag hunt doesn't eliminate conflict. Okay, so one assumption is that the stag hunt simplifies things, it's a mutualistic Rousseau world, and we all go prancing off happily into the wilderness hunting stags, and cooperation evolves. However, the stag hunt doesn't eliminate conflict. As well, communication is very important to make sure that you've got coordination. And so in a couple of the studies described before, communication was an important element there. Knowledge of the game is also important. That's a point I'll come back to in a moment. You can also, mutualism might also explain how you acquire resources, like how you decide to hunt for stag, but it doesn't necessarily explain then what happens once you've acquired the stag, because now you've got a new dilemma. How are you going to share the resources? Okay, and so allocation of effort and how the resources are divided up can lead to further disputes. And the question I'm interested in here is, can a hyper-cooperative motivation derail mutually beneficial cooperation? So remember, stag should be one of the equilibria that should be fairly easily achieved because, hey, you benefit the most from doing that, as does your partner, and that point becomes relevant. So I'm going to describe the current studies. There are 3 experiments, and the players could choose one of 2 cards. So it was a card game, and it was run at the Science Museum in London by my PhD student at the time, Liam Pollock, who is now teaching English in Cambodia, last I heard. I haven't heard from him in years, so I don't know what happened to him. He's in Cambodia. Okay. So anyways, the outcomes could be stag, where both players choose stag hare, or hare. You notice that the pictures, I mean, the image maybe isn't clear, but for the non-biologists in the crowd, there's a fox on the left, a lion on the right. They're not stags or hares. That was part of another study, but the cards worked very well. In fact, it was great to not have images of stags or hares because we didn't want to bias any sort of preferences, and we would counterbalance. Sometimes playing 2 foxes counted as stag, sometimes playing 2 lions counted as stag. They were just animals. Okay, now there were, like I said, there were 3 studies, and the basic idea is that the cards are hidden from view, and so there was this big ramp that was used for yet another study that was used to occlude the cards. The children would then play for little balls that could later be traded in for prizes. By the way, in England, it's very difficult to use food as prizes for kids. Ethics committee says, oh, you can't give the children gummy bears because. Okay, you can't use gummy bears. And then the Science Museum said, in addition, you can't use stickers because they might stick them all over our museums. So the solution we arrived at is I spent, a couple £1,000 on gift shop merchandise. I don't think they had ulterior motives, but anyway, so we used gift shop merchandise which the children could trade their balls in for. Okay, so one thing that was important here is that it was repeatedly emphasized to the children that the games were independent, that they could get as many balls as they wanted, and the more balls they got, the bigger the prize. That's it, okay? There was emphasized that that was how the game worked. So I'll go through the studies, hopefully quickly enough. In experiment 1, we'll call it the parent study, children played against their parents. Payoffs were made explicit at the start, which are explained, or they discovered how the game worked during the course of the game. The experiment 2 involved comparing how children compared when playing against parents versus playing against strangers, the experimenter. And the third experiment, which I think is the more interesting one, was when they played against same-aged peers, either known or not known to them. So in experiment 1, payoffs were made explicit, so you explain the rules, here's how the game works, blah, blah, blah. Or they discovered how the game works through the course of the game, which is in some ways more naturalistic and representative of how things work in nature, and also is a more chimp-friendly thing, which is an approach that Brosnan et al., Son's Pretty Picture, had done. In that study, there were 118 children ranging from 4 to 10 years of age. They played against their parents. This was to increase the level of trust. 62 were mothers, 55 were fathers. And the players would simultaneously choose one of 2 cards over 20 rounds of play. And so remember, if they both played stag, they both got the highest possible reward. If they both played hare, they both got the smallest possible reward. And if one played hare and the other one played stag, one person got a point and the other person got no points. And this is what we found. There was very, very little stag-stag cooperation. Okay? When the child plays stag and the parent plays hare was the predominant response. So the parents were, for the most part, playing cooperatively by choosing stag, and the kids were beating them by playing hare. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? So and like I said, the parents predominantly chose stag, and so these are 20 trials. So as you can see, choosing stag occurred about 4 out of 20 trials. It did not matter whether the game was explained or whether the outcomes were revealed during the course of the game. There was still very little difference. So whether they were told how the game worked or not didn't matter. In fact, what's interesting is when the game was explained to the children, if you both play stag, you get the highest possible reward. They predominantly chose hare. Okay? They knew what to do. They knew what to do to win. Dad played stag. Kid played hare. Win. Okay? That seems to be how they approached the game. There was no significant difference between ages. Again, children predominantly chose hare. So again, it's interesting that there's no age effect there. Okay, so this came as a bit of a surprise to us. So we thought, all right, well, how about we just have the children play against their parents? This is a much smaller sample because this is kind of the lead up to the next study. And we also had them play against strangers because maybe they play differently. Maybe they're nicer to their parents than they are to the strangers, so they didn't seem very nice there. We used the explained feature, and they were given, interesting thing here is the parents and strangers didn't have a choice. They were given a predetermined set of cards that matched the distribution of play that we saw in the first study. So we tried to map this as close to the first study as possible. And they were as uncooperative when playing with a stranger as with their parents. So again, children weren't particularly cooperative. They were just focusing on the outcomes, and they were using hare as a strategy. Maybe they're just being risk dominant because parents did sometimes admit that they were sometimes kind of testing their kids. Oh, you want to play it that way, do you? Well, here's a hare. Okay, so this leads to the third study, which is the real gist of it, which is when you have kids playing against kids, because parents don't matter really, and parents don't care about gift shop toys, who they would give it to the kids in the end anyways. So they played against same-age pairs. 33 were known, 28 were stranger pairs. Playoffs were explained in advance. Okay, again, what we see as an outcome is very little stag, a lot of hare, and some stag hare. So the kids are predominantly choosing hare. Okay, so they're falling on a strategy of the risk-dominant strategy. Either they don't trust each other or they're competing. They really seem, in my view, to try to win against each other. There was no significant difference between ages. Incidentally, I didn't have the raw data with me, but basically they were slightly nicer to either their friends or siblings than they were to strangers. Not a lot, but they were a little bit nicer, but I'm sorry I don't have the data with me at hand. And this is an example of the decline of stag play across rounds. Okay, so they start off with a little bit of stag, 30% or so, and then it declines over time to pretty much nothing. So the take-home of this is that children from 4 to 10 do not achieve the best group or individual outcomes in a stag hunt game, regardless of whether they're playing adults, strangers, or peers. The knowledge of the game did not increase coordination. Payoff dominant coordination decreased across rounds rather than increased once they discovered how the game worked. The best outcome came with friends and siblings, but it still wasn't fantastic and didn't match the other stag hunt studies. Children in these studies seem to be trying to win the stag hunt, treating it like a zero-sum game when there's a winner and a loser, even though the game is designed not to be that way. Now, it might be that the game, how the game is framed, could prime competitiveness. Maybe just the sight of cards makes them think this is a card game. Card games have winners and losers. That's possible. It may also be that other tasks, such as Shona do-goods, here prime cooperation, because the game is set up in a way that looks like something they would have learned to do in a cooperative way. It's interesting to note that these effects even occur at all, but this is a point of discussion. So just to finish, it may be that children are hyper-competitive as well as being, in some cases, hyper-cooperative. This may be due to social comparison interfering in producing what Sheshkin-Wynn and Blumenwyn call anti-equality. The children behave like rotten kids. Now, there's a theory in economics called rotten kid theorem, which doesn't sound as much fun as I would have thought, but still the idea is that the kids were behaving in a rather rotten way. So the point is, while mutualism can explain much of why humans cooperate, self-interest as well as hyper-competitiveness can lead to irrational conflicts, and that can explain things as we see, such as the tragedy of the commons. So while humans are uniquely cooperative, we're also uniquely competitive, because here are other shots related to these space missions. We've got extreme patriotism. Everyone's waving an American flag over this international NASA-led effort to space, as well as Chinese patriotism, because as you know, there's the famous quote of Neil Armstrong, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. The Lunar Project chief designer called the separation of the rover a small step for the rover, but one giant leap for the Chinese nation. Okay, so the space race is very much competitive. So I want to thank Liam Pollock and the team that helped with the study, as well as the Science Museum and all the participants. Kuznam to you. And I'm hoping that BCCC, I like this diagram, by the way. Now I remember how many C's there are, because it forms a triangle, because it's always confusing. So we're hoping the next one is BCCCD rather than VCCCD. You can follow us, you can follow the Stand with CU, BCCD, all these things on Twitter to see what's been happening here in case you were napping during the talks, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. We have some time for a question. 1, 2, 3. Let's start with the...
Hi, thanks for a really fun and interesting set of results. I have 2 questions. So one is, how robust cross-culturally do you think this effect is? You could marshal arguments both for robustness and non-robustness. So I'm just curious what you think about that. And also, did you look for any sex differences in this competitiveness?
Okay, so 2 good questions. Thank you. I really rushed through the results. There were no sex differences, and it also didn't matter whether it was mothers or fathers. And so, no, we didn't see any sex differences. That is something we look for. As far as how this might pan out cross-culturally, great question. I don't think that this would necessarily be found in all cultures. You know, this whole game drive that we might have might be unique to the weird population. And the kids were already older than in studies such as yours. So I don't know how robust or universal this will be, but it's puzzling from a purely rational point of view that it even exists at all. There's some very rational choices made there. Thank you.
Over here. I'll try to make this more of a question and less of a therapy session, but the question I have is why, I'm sure you have it too, but maybe you have a different answer than I do. Why do we create opportunities for competitiveness when it's perfectly good / better to be cooperative? It seems to me like I create these opportunities with everyone I know and love to their chagrin, to figure out, to test how much I should respect them and they should respect me, to establish dominance, to establish a hierarchy, to figure out you're better than me in this respect, but I'm better than you in this respect. So it seems like it's a way of sorting out our place in the world, and we're always feeling tenuous about our place in the world. But I'm wondering if you have a different perspective on this, or if there's, this is just like I said, a gut intuition. What's the science saying? What do you think?
Well, so one thing is we're really prone to social comparison, so it's hard not to do this. And if you've ever stood in a supermarket lineup, it's hard to not see which line is progressing faster than your line. So we're always looking for information about how we compare to others. And this might influence how competitive we are. We also produce competitive games. We have to tell the kids not to be so competitive. And even in sporting events where everyone wins as a team, guess who gets the endorsements? We don't endorse the whole, usually it's just one player. So there's competition at all levels, and we're very sensitive to it through social comparison. One of my interests is other regarding concerns. So we're very concerned about the welfare of others. This empathy can play a role in all of this, but this also leads to the dark side of Schadenfreude, for instance. So we also care about the demise of others. So the fact that we're so well tuned to others makes us more competitive than you would find normally, because not only do we look at how well we've done, we look at how well others are doing. So the kids in this study were getting far fewer nice toys than they could have had they just chosen to play stag. So I'm not sure how well this is addressing your question, but the main feeling I have is that we have this social drive to compare ourselves to others, and we're very averse to being worse off than others.
Hello.
Hi.
So it's interesting that the discussion already started talking about how adults compare themselves to others, but as far as I understood, you didn't actually look at how adults would play this game, and if they would, what kind of strategies they would use if it's just two adults participating. And I'm interested in that because in the paper you cited at the end, this anti-equality sort of decreases a little bit with age, as far as I remember, and it seems like it would actually be kind of awkward in a game if there's another adult who's like really trying to win, and we actually feel like we should probably suppress that a little bit and be more norm conform or cooperate more, because then we're showing that we're generous, and that makes us feel great as well. So I'm wondering what your expectation would be in this task with adults.
I think it would be really sensitive to how you frame it, whether they treat it as competitive or cooperative. It also depend a lot on the incentives. The incentives I had weren't that interesting. I probably still have a big box load, by the way, of planets that you can suspend from the ceiling. I couldn't get rid of all of them. Probably not that interesting to you. This is something Sarah Brosnan, if I recall correctly, in her paper did look at adults as well with the explained versus unexplained games to see how they arrived at these conclusions. And the point was that it's harder than you'd think to arrive at cooperative outcomes. And so depending on how you set up anonymity and all these other things, this can lead to competition. A classic example, of course, would be the public goods game, where cooperation, which is in everyone's best interest, declines over time, usually fairly rapidly, just because of the problem of free riders. Now, whether hyper-competitiveness would feed into that, I don't know, and that would be interesting to investigate.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I have two questions. One, I was curious, so another aspect of competition is that it's more fun when it's with a worthy adversary. And so if you might speculate if children might be more likely to cooperate if they were playing with a younger child than a child their age. I guess that's the first question. But.
Okay, so I think that's actually a really good idea. So if we had kids play with younger kids, particularly say siblings, they might actually scaffold their behavior by helping them win, or at least do equally. So yes, that actually could be an important question, yes.
And the second question is somewhat related to resource scarcity. I was curious about the description kids got about the rewards. Was there a sense that there were plenty rewards of every size, or was there a sense that there was like one big reward?
Oh, that would have been fun. That's starting to sound evil, which I like. We had a lot of rewards, and we had a rewards table where they could see what they could get and how many tokens or balls they needed to get those rewards, but there's no scarcity of rewards. Like I said, I still have balls of planets.
Thank you, that's all.
Thank you.